All right, deep divers, welcome back. Today we're tackling something really heavy, the accusations of genocide against Israel after this recent conflict with Hamas.
Yeah.
And, we've got a whole stack of sources here, Wikipedia articles, an opinion piece from Al Jazeera, a Washington Post piece. And, well, it seems like everyone's wrestling with this question. Are we actually seeing genocide in Gaza?
Well, it's a question that really needs careful consideration,
Agree.
especially with a term as serious as genocide.
Yeah, for sure.
I think before we can even begin to assess the situation in Gaza, we need to really understand legally what genocide even is.
Right, exactly. Because you
Wow.
can't just throw around genocide as a synonym for, just awful violence.
Right.
It's got a very specific legal definition, doesn't it?
Absolutely, it does.
Okay.
The UN defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy a national or ethnical, racial, or religious group in whole or in part.
Okay.
And the real key word there is intent. It's not just about how much destruction there is, but the motivation behind it.
Right.
And to prove that intent in court. Super difficult.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. We've got these accusations of genocide flying around, coming from all kinds of sources, experts, governments, NGOs,
Yeah.
and they're pointing to things like the destruction we see in Gaza of civilian infrastructure, the blockade, even some of the rhetoric from Israeli officials.
Yeah, it's important to remember that these accusations aren't just appearing out of thin air.
Yeah.
The situation in Gaza has been dire for years, especially since Hamas took control in 2007.
Right.
And then Israel imposed that blockade. And that blockade has actually been labeled as a type of collective punishment by some.
Yeah.
Meaning that the entire population is being targeted, not just Hamas militants.
And that's, I think, where things start to get really murky, ethically speaking.
Yeah.
Because if you're intentionally making life unbearable for an entire population, restricting their movement, limiting their access to basic necessities,
Yeah.
can you really say that you're only going after a militant group?
That's the real heart of the debate. And the recent conflict has just brought this tension into such sharp focus. The sheer scale of destruction in Gaza is unbelievable. We're talking about homes, hospitals, water systems, things that are essential for survival.
Right.
Those who are making this accusation of genocide argue that this level of destruction, along with the ongoing blockade, is essentially creating conditions aimed at exterminating Palestinians in Gaza.
So they're saying it's not just about, isolated incidents of violence here and there, but a systematic effort to just make life in Gaza unsustainable.
Exactly.
Right.
And they point to things like the severely limited access to clean water, the crippled healthcare system, the widespread lack of food security in Gaza.
Right.
All consequences of both this recent conflict and that long-standing blockade.
Yeah, that sounds like a humanitarian nightmare. And then you add in these reports of Israeli officials using really inflammatory rhetoric, like Prime Minister Netanyahu repeatedly referencing Amalek. To be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the historical context there.
Oh, that's crucial. Because understanding that historical reference really sheds light on why those statements are raising so many eyebrows. The Amalekites are this biblical enemy of the Israelites.
Okay.
They're actually described in the book of Samuel as an enemy that God commanded the Israelites to completely annihilate men, women, and children.
Oh, wow, that's intense.
Yeah.
So when Netanyahu is bringing up that imagery, it's not just some casual historical reference.
Right. For many, it signals that Palestinians are being dehumanized, that they're being framed as an enemy deserving of total eradication.
Right.
And when you put that kind of rhetoric together with the actions we've already talked about, the blockade, the destruction, it just feeds into this argument that Israel's intent goes beyond just targeting Hamas.
Yeah, it paints a very chilling picture, to say the least. But of course, there's the other side of the coin here, too.
Sure.
There are lots of people, especially in Western media and governments, who completely reject that genocide label.
Right.
So what are their main arguments?
They argue that even though Israel's actions are destructive, there's no doubt about that the main target is Hamas,
Right.
which is a recognized terrorist organization.
Okay.
They see it as a complex conflict with deep historical roots,
Okay.
not a straightforward case of genocide.
So their argument is that Israel is in a war against terrorism, not against Palestinians as a whole.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they often bring up that Hamas uses human shields and embeds itself within the civilian population, which makes it incredibly difficult to avoid civilian casualties.
It sounds like the classic he said, she said scenario where the truth is probably somewhere in between.
Right.
But even with that, fog of war, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
there are some actual legal developments we can't ignore.
You're talking about the International Criminal Court, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
ICC recently issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant, specifically for war crimes and crimes against humanity relating to using starvation as a method of warfare.
Right. And while they weren't specifically charged with genocide, the fact that the ICC is even involved is a pretty big deal, isn't it?
It's a huge development, and it's making serious waves internationally. And keep in mind, a lot of Israel's allies are parties to the ICC, so they're obligated to enforce these warrants.
Okay, so what does that mean practically? Will Netanyahu actually be arrested?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. It's unlikely he'll be extradited or arrested anytime soon.
Okay.
But these warrants will definitely restrict his freedom of movement. For example, Ireland has already said they'll enforce the warrant. So Netanyahu can pretty much forget about that Dublin vacation.
Wow. So even if he never actually sees a trial, these warrants have real consequences.
Exactly. They limit his ability to engage in diplomacy on a global scale, which could have a huge impact on Israel's standing internationally.
But will any of this change anything for people on the ground in Gaza? That seems like the biggest question looming over everything.
The million-dollar question. And it really brings us to the U.S. role in all of this.
Yeah.
We're seeing such a range of reactions within the U.S. From Democratic senators demanding restrictions on military aid to Israel to Republican representatives using some really disturbing rhetoric that seems to just condone more violence.
And then you've got this lawsuit that was filed against President Biden by the Center for Constitutional Rights.
Right.
Arguing that the U.S. is actually complicit in genocide by providing unconditional support to Israel.
It's a controversial claim, no doubt.
Oh, yeah.
But it just underlines how deeply divided people are on this issue, both internationally and within the U.S. And these ICC warrants only make that scrutiny more intense.
Right.
They force the U.S. to really confront what it means to have these close ties with Israel, especially with their commitment to human rights and international law.
It puts the U.S. between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they have this long-standing alliance with Israel, and on the other, they're facing accusations of enabling atrocities.
And that takes us to a pretty critical question. Is the U.S. actually making the cycle of violence and suffering in Gaza worse by giving Israel unconditional support? We'll explore that in much more detail when we come back.
Right. Sounds good.
So welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how complex of a role the U.S. plays in this conflict and how its absolute unwavering support for Israel is getting a lot of scrutiny.
Yeah.
Especially in light of these accusations against Israel and the ICC warrants.
Yeah.
It really begs the question, are we as a global community just turning a blind eye to what may be happening in Gaza?
That is a really tough question.
Yeah.
And to answer that, I think we have to dig deeper into the actual evidence that's being used to support those accusations of genocide. Because remember, it's not enough to just point to suffering and say, oh, there's destruction happening.
Yeah.
There needs to be hard evidence of that very specific intent to destroy a group,
Right.
either in whole or in part.
And those who believe this does constitute genocide are pointing to a pattern of actions that, they say, reveals this intent.
Okay.
For example, let's look a little closer at this blockade.
Oh.
Critics argue that it's not really about security, like Israel says, but it's about creating conditions that are just unbearable for the Palestinian population living in Gaza.
So the argument is it's not just about, keeping Hamas in check militarily.
Right.
It's about strangling Gaza.
That's the idea. The blockade really limits imports and exports, which totally cripples Gaza's economy.
Right.
It restricts movement for people, making it basically impossible for Palestinians to travel for things like work or education or medical care.
Wow.
Essential things that they need, like food and medicine, are just constantly in short supply.
And, our sources show that this blockade has been condemned pretty widely by international organizations. They're saying it breaks international law.
Absolutely. Tons of human rights groups and even UN agencies have condemned it.
Wow.
Calling it collective punishment, which is a huge no-no under international law.
All right, so we have this blockade that's going on for years that's creating this humanitarian crisis.
Right.
And then you pile on top of that all of the massive destruction that we saw during the recent conflict.
Exactly.
Our sources really highlight the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, homes, hospitals, water treatment plants.
Yeah.
You can't tell me that was just an accident.
Exactly. the people supporting this genocide label are saying that this destruction isn't just an oops of war,
Yeah.
but a tactic that's used to make life in Gaza unsustainable.
Right.
And they're saying when you put that destruction on top of the already horrible conditions from the blockade, what you end up with is essentially slow motion extermination.
So basically, Israel is weaponizing the things that people need to survive. Food, water, shelter, healthcare.
Yeah.
To make the Palestinian population in Gaza suffer?
That's their argument. And they point to the devastating consequences. Things like malnutrition running rampant, especially with the children, the healthcare system being on the verge of collapse. People are literally dying from things that are totally preventable.
Wow.
Because they can't access the treatment they need.
That's awful. And then you've got those comments from Israeli officials like Netanyahu invoking the Amalekites.
Yeah.
That rhetoric just adds a whole other layer of messed up context, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Because remember in the Bible, God commanded the Israelites to completely wipe out the Amalekites.
Yeah.
So when Netanyahu uses that kind of language, it's not just a history lesson. It tacks into this really troubling ideology that some people are afraid is actually driving policy decisions.
So it's like he's saying it's okay to get rid of all Palestinians by using this ancient biblical command.
That's exactly the concern, and it's shared by a lot of people who are watching this situation very closely.
But let's play devil's advocate here. What are the people who don't think this is genocide saying in response to all of this? They have to have some counter-arguments.
They do. Their main argument is that Israel is fighting a war on terrorism. Not a war against Palestinians. They point to the fact that Hamas is a recognized terrorist organization and that they use human shields and deliberately hide within the civilian population.
So they're saying that even though civilian casualties are tragic, they're unavoidable in this type of war.
Yeah, that's their position. They also argue that the blockade is totally necessary to stop Hamas from getting weapons and launching attacks against Israel. And they often mention the fact that Israel has made attempts to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza.
So they're basically saying that Israel is trying their best to keep civilian casualties down while fighting a ruthless enemy that doesn't play by the rules of war.
And they argue that to call this genocide is not only wrong, but it also lessens how serious the word is and trivializes the historical horrors of actual genocides like the Holocaust.
Yeah, that's a very sensitive argument. But even if we say, okay, the conflict is complex and Israel is dealing with some real challenges fighting terrorism, the question still is it okay to make an entire population suffer this much in the name of security?
That's the big moral and legal question everyone's debating right now. And those ICC warrants, even though they're not specifically for genocide, definitely fan the flames of that debate. They suggest that even if Israel isn't trying to wipe out Palestinians, what they're doing might still be war crimes or crimes against humanity.
And those warrants are already having a real impact. Netanyahu's travel is restricted. He might be isolated diplomatically. But what about the bigger picture here? How is this affecting how the international community responds to what's happening in Gaza?
That's a key question and one that we're going to explore much deeper next time. Because regardless of how this all plays out legally, just the accusations of genocide have sparked a conversation worldwide about accountability, about complicity, about what justice even means in this seemingly impossible to solve conflict.
We're back. And wow, this deep dive has taken us down a dark road. We've looked at these genocide accusations against Israel. We've explored all the evidence and really struggled with these complex moral and legal questions.
It's heavy stuff.
But now I think it's time to maybe shift gears a little bit and ask, okay, what are the possible consequences of all of this, both for the people who are directly involved and for the international community as a whole?
I think one of the most immediate things to worry about is that the region could become even more unstable. The conflict has already crossed borders into neighboring countries, and it could easily get even wider, pull in more people, and just escalate the violence.
And we can't forget about the humanitarian crisis that's happening right now in Gaza.
Absolutely.
We're talking about 2.3 million people stuck in this tiny strip of land, barely any access to food, water, healthcare, any of the basic necessities.
It's hard to imagine it getting worse, but it could.
The human cost of this is just immeasurable.
It really is. We're talking about generations of Palestinians who have only ever known war displacement and just not having enough. The trauma, the mental toll. It's a wound that might never heal.
And even on the Israeli side, they live with this constant fear of rocket attacks. the psychological weight of living in this never-ending conflict.
It's a lose-lose for everyone involved.
It really is.
Yeah.
And beyond the immediate human suffering,
Yeah.
there are bigger geopolitical consequences to consider too.
For sure.
Israel's global reputation has already taken a hit.
Mm-hmm.
These ICC warrants, whether they're enforced or not, are just isolating them even more diplomatically.
Right.
And it could push them closer to countries that don't have the best human rights records.
It's a dangerous downward spiral.
It really is. And like we said, the U.S.'s role in all of this is so important. Their unwavering support for Israel, militarily and diplomatically, is really being questioned, especially with all these accusations and the ICC getting involved.
The ICC warrants are a tough spot for the U.S.
Yeah.
If they keep backing Israel no matter what,
Right.
they risk alienating their allies, losing their moral standing,
Right.
and maybe even emboldening those who are already criticizing U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
But pulling back their support would mean abandoning an ally in a very volatile region.
Right. It's a no-win situation.
It really is.
So what does all of this mean for the average person, just trying to make sense of this really complicated and heartbreaking situation?
Right.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed,
Oh, yeah.
like there's nothing we can do.
Absolutely.
But I have to believe that we can make a difference somehow.
I agree with you. It starts with awareness.
Okay?
Educating ourselves, saying no to simple narratives, and challenging media bias. So we need to be critical of the information we're getting.
Yeah.
Look for different perspectives.
And have real conversations, even with people who see things differently than we do.
Exactly. And then we can turn that awareness into action.
Okay, how so?
Contact our elected officials, tell them to make human rights a priority in their foreign policy decisions,
Yeah.
and demand that they hold everyone accountable for their actions.
We can support organizations that are working to provide humanitarian aid,
Yes.
document human rights abuses,
Yeah.
and promote peace and reconciliation.
Absolutely.
And I think the most important thing is that we have to engage in dialogue,
Couldn't agree more.
talk to people who have different viewpoints,
Yeah.
challenge hate speech and dehumanizing rhetoric.
Absolutely, because the only way to find a real, lasting peace is by changing our mindsets, recognizing that everyone involved is human.
That's so important to remember, that at the heart of all of this are real people whose lives have been torn apart by violence and hatred.
And even though it might feel like a small thing,
Yeah.
our actions, our voices, our choices, they do matter.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to think about as they keep trying to understand this complex issue.
Okay.
If starvation is being used as a weapon of war, like those ICC warrants suggest, what does that say about the future of conflict and international law?
And maybe even more importantly, what can we do to hold powerful nations accountable for what they do, especially in situations as difficult as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Those aren't easy questions, but they're questions that we as global citizens can't afford to ignore anymore.
That's right.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the tough questions, keep pushing for accountability, and keep trying to make a difference. We'll see you next time.